Okay, so let's just start with the usual unpleasantness, right? So for Monday, right, so over the weekend, right, remember that you're going to have the vocab quiz to complete by Sunday, but then that's the last one, right? No more vocab quizzes after that one. And on Monday, I will give you all a list of the terms from the quizzes that I want you to know for the final, right? The ones that might appear in the final, so the ones to really be aware of. I will also reopen all the old vocab quizzes so that you can look through them and see how you define things and whatnot. This will also give you a basis for asking questions when we do the review session. Complete the annotated bibliography, again, remember, by Friday, right? We moved that back a couple of days. And you'll have your last timeline submissions due on Monday. And the last set of timeline submissions will be about immigration and empire from 1901 to the present, right? And remember that you're talking about immigration to the United Kingdom, right? Not to the United States. And the next to last set of text you're going to be reading, right? We're going back to volume F. You're going to be reading Jamaica Language by Louise Bennett, Nation Language by Kamal Braithwaite, Decolonization of the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and English as an Indian Literary Language by Salman Rushdie. So all told, this is about 10 pages. Most of it's not that difficult. The Bennett piece you're probably going to have a little bit of trouble with when you first try to go over it, but it's real short. And as you're reading it, try to imagine, try to pronounce the words phonetically, right? Just, imagine how it would sound. And that would it'll probably make it a little bit easier to understand. So does anybody have any questions about anything?
So for final schedule?
Uh-huh.
So is our schedule next week normal? And then that Friday is going to be...
Yeah, otherwise our schedule next week is normal.
Okay,
yeah,
just checking.
I
know there's other things going on with different classes.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's because we're on a Monday, Wednesday rather than a Tuesday, Thursday schedule. And I think we had to give up because we got Labor Day off. Then we go, the Monday, Wednesday class is extending to the whole week, where the Tuesday, Thursday classes end midweek.
Well, are we still going to do the review Thursday?
We will still do the review Thursday. Yeah.
Okay, and what time?
9 to 10.
I think, yeah, we said
I wasn't sure
9
what
to 10,
time.
yeah.
December 9th, 9 to 10.
Yeah.
Okay,
And,
I didn't
yeah.
know what time we said. I didn't write that down.
Yeah, and so we'll set it for 9 to 10. I can stay longer than that if people need me to. I'll be here probably all day anyway.
Okay.
Any other questions about the exam or the paper or any assignments that are coming due?
So for the annotated bibliography, you're good with Galileo sources, right?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, yeah, Galileo sources are the way to go.
Okay, just checking.
Mm-hmm.
So for, let's say I pick Angel in the House.
Okay.
So if I do Angel in the House, I choose 2 of the excerpts that coincide with that.
Uh-huh.
And then I would have to do either Fallen Woman or the other woman. I can't remember.
The new woman?
New Woman, thank you. Is that right?
No, I mean, if you just want to compare texts that are talking about, the angel in the house, or they're talking about a fallen woman kind of figure, that's right. One thing you could try to do is show either continuity over time or progress over time, right? So if you think, for example, that that there is a point in history where literature seems to make progress past the angel in the house kind of thing, then that would be okay. So here's this creepy angel in the house text, right? And here's something more progressive from later in history. That is a thing you could do. You could also show that maybe things don't change that much between historical periods, right? Okay, so here's an angel in the house in 1860, and oh hey, we've still got an angel in the house in 1960, right? That it's the same sort of thing. You don't have to compare it to other tropes, right? You're just comparing it to other texts.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's funny you mentioned that, because that's exactly what I'm doing.
Just saying,
Okay.
just saying.
Well, it just stuck out from the Angel in the House idea.
Uh-huh.
Are we all doing Angel in the House?
You know, well, I mean, it's like, I usually get, even like with a bigger class, I usually get a lot of papers on that particular concept.
It's a good concept.
And
Yeah,
it's much
it
easier
is.
to talk about, and it
Uh-huh.
was sort of, I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like we all discussed
Mhm.
a lot in it, and it was easy
Yeah.
to get into.
Yeah, and I think it's something that's kind of easy to locate historically as well, so,
And it was interesting.
yeah,
It is interesting.
yeah.
Look at us go.
I just wasn't sure if it had to be both, like you had
Uh-huh.
to take both parts and.
No, yeah, if you're talking about the angel in the house, you don't also have to talk about the fallen woman or the new woman.
Okay.
I'm talking about Angel in the House and to roommate.
Okay.
So like,
I guess it's because I picked that, I thought you had to, you know what I mean? Guess I got confused thinking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that, and I
yeah.
sort of obsessed over
Yeah.
that.
Now, you can certainly address those things, right? But they don't have to be a focus of the paper.
I promise we did not put our heads together.
No, I am honestly, I am not at all surprised that this happened.
you're clearing up right here, right now. There is no cheating.
No, I know, yeah, you all seemed genuinely surprised. The others were doing similar things.
That's all right.
You guys have any other questions about the final or the final paper? Okay. All right, so you should have some timeline stuff for me today, right?
We should.
Yes.
My next week out of that one.
All right, I'll go first.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. In 1841, Britain occupied Hong Kong.
Okay.
Very short, I'm just saying.
Uh-huh.
In 1853, the construction of railways in India, that was not coming out, I'm sorry,
Okay.
began. And in 1870, British troops were withdrawn from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada.
Okay. Very good. All right. Carolyn, what do you got?
I did for
Okay, in 1840, Joseph J. Gouverneur, I don't know how to say it, wrote The Inequality of Human Race, and
Okay.
claims the Aryan race superior to other great strains, and lays down the aristocratic class
Uh-huh.
doctrine of Aryanism. Sorry, I can't read my own handwriting right now.
Uh-huh.
Okay, in 1850, the first English translation of Rig Veda by H.H. Wilson founded to promote the translation of the scriptures into English,
Okay.
so as to enable his countrymen to proceed in the conversation of the natives of India
Mhm.
to the Christian religion.
Right, the Rig Veda being the oldest known Hindu religious text. Yeah. Okay, good.
In 1851, Sir M. Monier Williams publishes English Sanskrit Dictionary.
Uh-huh.
His complete Sanskrit English Dictionary is released in 1899 after 3 decades of his work.
Okay. Interesting. Good stuff. Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up Gobineau's book as well. I think that's how you pronounce his name.
That sounds right? but
Yeah.
It was hard.
Yeah, because that's the basis for a lot of the imperialist thinking that happens in Europe in the 19th century. This notion that you can kind of divide human beings up into superior and inferior classifications. And in fact, you see throughout anthropology textbooks from the 19th century exactly that, where usually you have people of Northern European looking stock at the top, people of, say, Mediterranean or Celtic looking stock somewhere kind of in the middle, and usually people, like Africans typically, black Africans at the bottom, right? So one of the things that a lot of imperialists use to kind of justify their projects was this notion that they were bringing the light of civilization to what they regarded as the dark places of the earth, right?
Interesting though, because the Aryan race has blue eyes and blonde hair, right?
Uh-huh.
And blue eyes means there was an incest in prior families. So, in a biological standpoint,
Sure.
that's exactly what that means.
Yeah, I mean, right, it's a recessive trait.
Yeah, so that's interesting, that's a dominant or race or whatever, I think that's interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, it really, and I think a lot of it just has to do with, justifying the superiority of your own particular group, right? It's, but yeah, so let's start by looking at the changes in the size of the British Empire between about 1815 and about 1900. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait for the technology to cooperate.
For the final exam, will we pick 2 questions or just one and write a longer?
You will pick 2 questions, and both will be 500-word responses.
Cool.
Okay, so as this is coming into focus here, right, all of the territory on the map here that is not gray is British occupied territory in 1815, right? And we can see that there are some kind of differences here in the way, in the pattern of settlement, right? So on the one hand, like all of these blue areas are regions that are claimed but not actually settled. So for example, most of the interior of Australia, most of the interior of Canada as well, right? It's claimed, but the British have not attempted to settle there. The parts in orange are British territory that was held prior to 1793. So that would be around the time slightly after the American Revolution. The bits in black were acquired during wars mostly with the French, between 1793 and 1814. And the territories in yellow are temporarily occupied by the British during wartime. Now, what do you notice about the parts of the empire here that are actually settled? Where do they tend to be?
Near water.
Yeah, they're almost all coastal, right? There's some territory in the interior that's held, right? But all of the settled territory in the empire is on the coasts. And the foundation of British trade and of British military superiority in this period was naval superiority, right? The British Navy had no major rivals. Now, then let's look at 1900. So everything in pink is British occupied territory in the year 1900. And what do we notice has changed here?
We have all of Australia.
Yeah, all of Australia, good.
And all of Canada.
All of Canada.
And parts of Africa.
Yeah, they've moved into the interior in Africa, right? All they had were these kind of little settlements, basically kind of like trade settlements along the coasts in the northwest and in the south. And now they've expanded into the interior.
Pretty expanded into Asia.
Yeah, all of South Asia is British, right? Plus a little bit of Southeast Asia. And there's still these little patches here as well in South and Central America. Right? Belize in Central America is English speaking. because that was, it was a British colony at one time. And Guyana in South America is also, to this day, English speaking. But yeah, so by 1900, the British Empire occupies about a quarter of the Earth's surface. But not all of these colonies are administered in quite the same ways. So there are three basic kinds of colony. The first I'm going to call a chartered colony. And these chartered colonies were essentially business enterprises. They were run by corporations. For example, the early American colonies were of this type. Plymouth, the Plymouth colony, right? Jamestown colony, right? They were meant to make, they were business enterprises. They were meant to make money. But of course, by this time, they're no longer part of the British Empire. India, prior to 1857, was administered by the British East India Company, not by the British government. You also had what were called crown colonies. And crown colonies were administered directly from Great Britain, right, by the British government. So Parliament would appoint a governor to go out to these particular colonies and rule, right? There was often a kind of like local elected council of citizens that was meant to advise the governor, but effectively the governor had free rein to do what he wanted. And so this would include places like Canada, Australia, Jamaica was a crown colony, and India after 1857. Now, the final type of colony was called a protectorate. And this was the colonial model that dominated in Africa as British colonization increased there. So places like Uganda, which was then called Rhodesia, South Africa, what is now Nigeria. These were all protectorates. And technically, legally speaking, the British didn't rule there. Technically, local leaders were still supposed to be in charge, and the British were there in an advisory capacity. But given that they had they owned most of the military and economic might in whatever the colony was, they tended to dominate affairs there, right? So you had these three very different models of colonization. Some colonies were given much more freedom to self-govern than others. Can we guess, of the ones we got on the board here, which were probably given the most freedom to govern themselves?
India.
Canada and Australia, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, why Canada? Why do you think Canada and Australia?
Mostly white.
Yeah, in Canada and Australia, right? Think back to the Gobanu stuff, right? In Canada and Australia, the settler population had mostly displaced the indigenous population, right? In Canada, this was partly because it had been rather sparsely populated to begin with, and disease had killed off a lot of what Canadians call the First Nations tribes. In Australia, the Aboriginal peoples were mostly kind of pushed into the outback in the middle of the country, away from the coasts. Right? In fact, even today in Australia, actually really pretty much all of the major Australian cities are on the coasts, because the interior of the country is mostly desert, yeah. But yeah, Canada and Australia are mostly self-governing by this point, even though Australia had started out as a penal colony. And as the empire grows, there wasn't necessarily any kind of master plan for the growth of empire here, right? A lot of what happens is, as the European map after the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century kind of solidifies into what we recognize now, there's a lot less room for conquest and territory claiming within Europe. So these European powers all spread outward, and they're all claiming their colonies, right? So this part of Africa that is not British controlled was French controlled. In the middle here, you had the Belgians. You had the Germans down here along the coast, Italians along this coast, and so on and so forth, right? So there was a kind of pan-European scramble to build these empires. The British Empire just happened to be the largest and the richest. So, since the Victorian period is the the period of imperial expansion in British history, I thought it would be worth our while to look at the way over time some important Victorians thought about the growth of empire and the growth, the responsibilities that they felt, or lack of responsibility that they felt, to govern an empire. So let's start with Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education. It's on page 686. So before I get started here, were you guys able to make much sense of this, to figure out what Macaulay was arguing about here, or what the basic situation he's involving himself in is? Okay, so what's going on here?
He's basically saying that English is a superior language.
Yeah, he's claiming the superiority of English to other languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
In particular, the superiority of English
To Sanskrit and Arabic.
Yeah, to Sanskrit and Arabic. Yeah, and he's even getting the name of one of the languages he's talking about wrong, right? He's not actually talking about Arabic, he's talking about Persian.
Mm-hmm.
Arabic is not a language that is widely spoken in India. Persian, however, in the 19th century was. So yeah, what he's trying to argue for here is for education in India to be conducted entirely in English, right? So Macaulay on the one hand he was an important 19th century historian. He was also a member of Parliament, but he's speaking here in his capacity as a member of the board of directors of the British East India Company. And since this is written in 1835, right? What kind of colony is India at this point in history?
Charter.
Yeah, it's one of these chartered corporate colonies, right? So the British East India Company, not the British government, is running the show, at least in the parts of India that Britain controls, right? Which by 1835 isn't actually the whole country yet. And the argument that Macaulay is involving himself in is, again, like over which languages should be the language of instruction for Indian schools in British territories, right? So can I get somebody to read for us, starting with, we come now to the gist of the matter on page 686.
We have come to the gist of the matter. We have authority to employ as government shall direct for the intellectual improvement of the people of this country. The simple question is, what is the most useful way of employing it? All parties seem to be agreed on one point, that the dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India contain neither literacy or scientific information, and are moreover so poor and rude that until they are written from some other quarter, it will not be easy to translate any valuable work into them. It seems to be within all sides of the intellectual improvement of those classes of people who have the means of pursuing higher studies can at present be effected only by means of some language not vernacular amongst them.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of things in here. One, what language is he talking about? Sanskrit or Persian specifically here?
Persian.
He's actually not, like, he's actually referring to, like, one of the big problems that the East India Company is having in India, and maybe this is something that, maybe we all just kind of didn't know about the countries. That India is, and has been for since time immemorial, a kind of multilinguistic society, right? So there is no kind of overarching language that people speak in India. The most commonly spoken languages today are Hindi and Urdu, but that's a fairly recent historical development. There are a lot of local languages that are called Prakrits. That are often, like even within the same region, the local Prakrits might not be very closely related to each other, right? So there is a kind of genuine problem in administering an educational system that Macaulay is trying to solve, right? This system is going to include people who have no easy means of speaking to each other. But he's also not very complimentary about these local languages either, right? They contain neither literary nor scientific information, and are moreover so poor and rude that until they are reached from some other quarter, it will not be easy to translate any valuable work into them, right? So he's just assuming that these languages are basically worthless, right? Now, I also want to look at this last sentence here where he talks about those classes of the people who have the means of pursuing higher studies. Does he seem to be thinking about educating everybody in India? Yeah, this is only really about a relatively small subset of the population, right? Basically those who can afford the fees necessary to attend school, right? All right, thank you. So can I get somebody to continue for us? What then shall that language be?
What then shall that language be?
Thank you.
One half of the committee maintained that it should be the English. The other half strongly recommended Arabic and Sanskrit. The whole question seems to me to be, which language is the best worth knowing? I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, but I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I have read translations of most celebrated Arabic and transcript works. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongues. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the evaluation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one among them that could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. the intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is indeed fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education.
Okay, thank you. So actually, let's just quickly pause here for a minute. I realize I didn't. Do all of you know what Sanskrit is? Okay, so Sanskrit is the religious and literary language of Hindu India. So most early Hindu religious and philosophical texts and a good deal of Indian literature, poetry, plays, things like that, are written in Sanskrit. Sanskrit, as far as I can tell, has never been anybody's first language, right? It's not a language people speak at home. It's instead a kind of solely literary language, right? So it's kind of like the way Hebrew works for American and European Jews, right? They don't speak it in their houses, but it survives as a kind of ritual language, right? So right now it's Hanukkah, and when my wife is lighting the candles at home, she always sings the same Hebrew prayer that I have no idea what the hell it means, but.
That's cool, she speaks Hebrew.
What's that?
It's cool, she speaks Hebrew.
Well, she does and she doesn't. she remembers from childhood reciting this prayer, like the kind of the words, the pronunciations, and the musical intonations that go with it, right? But she doesn't actually know what the words mean. So Sanskrit is the literary and religious language of educated people in India, right? No one speaks it at home. But its usefulness would be that it is kind of understood across India. But what's this question that Macaulay asks at the end of this third paragraph here? What does the whole question him seem to be wrapped up in? Yeah, and that I feel like the way he frames this is interesting. Right? He's like, best worth knowing for what, right? He doesn't address that. Like, best worth knowing for what particular purpose? Assuming that his purposes and the purposes of the British East India Company are what's best and what should drive this, right? Now, what's the admission that he makes then immediately following the next paragraph? It's maybe a little strange for somebody making the argument he's trying to make.
He doesn't know anything about Sanskrit and Arabic.
Yeah, it's like, I have no knowledge of either of these languages, right?
It's easy to say that it would be so much easier for them to just have to learn English.
Yeah.
I mean, but is that
I know you're a native speaker. You're having trouble getting that out. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I mean, English is actually a particularly difficult language to learn, particularly for people who are used to languages with much more kind of regular rules and structures, right? So, like, for example, if you are somebody who grew up speaking French, which is governed by rigid rules that almost never have exceptions, right? Then English doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense to you when you're first trying to learn it, right?
Because there's like all different types of exceptions, and you can pronounce things different ways.
Yeah.
And if you pronounce something a certain way, then it means something different.
your way doesn't make sense, you're trying to learn something new. Spanish doesn't make any sense to me.
Sure. But well, and again, because like I think also like you're learning an entirely new system, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and you're learning a language that has a system,
We
and
don't have a system.
yeah, it's.
Just go with the flow.
But yeah, so he's admitting total ignorance of the languages that he is denigrating here, right? But he is taking this, he is taking the valuation of the Orientalists here. Now, an Orientalist is not an inhabitant of an Asian country. An Orientalist is a scholar who studies Asian and or Middle Eastern cultures. So he's not consulting people who live in and know India. He's not consulting people who are native to India. He's consulting other Europeans who have studied the country, right? And asking them for their opinion. So there's a kind of embedded assumption here that the opinion of a European scholar matters more than the opinion of even an educated Indian, right? And he continues here that even the Orientalists accept that European literature is vastly superior, right? It will hardly be disputed, I suppose, that the department of literature in which the Eastern writers stand highest is poetry. And I certainly never met with any Orientalist who ventured to maintain that the Arabic and Sanskrit poetry could be compared to that of the great European nations. But when we pass from works of imagination to works in which facts are recorded and general principles investigated, the superiority of the Europeans becomes absolutely immeasurable. It is, I believe, no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which has been collected from all the books written in the Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgments used at preparatory schools in England. In every branch of physical or moral philosophy, the relative position of the two nations is nearly the same. So, I would suggest here that maybe part of the issue is Macaulay's inability to look at Indian literature from a non-European frame of reference, right? Everything he sees in Indian literature looks to him different from what he sees in English literature and European literature, right? And so he's using that as his standard. And it's like, well, this doesn't agree with that at all. This doesn't measure up in any way. And as such is then casting aside Indian literature as valueless. But there's an ulterior motive here as well. I don't know if any of you were able to find it. Were any of you able to discover, as you read this, what Macaulay's real motive is for making sure that Indians learn English? I'm going to give you a little hint. It actually has to do with the status.
The government officials speak it.
The government officials speak it, and the government officials in India,
Speak English.
they speak English. What's that?
Just for money.
Yeah. It comes down to money ultimately, right? If we look further down page 687, right?
Oh, yeah.
Near the bottom of the page here, right? In India, English is the language spoken by the ruling class. It is spoken by the higher class of natives at the seats of government. It is likely to become the language of commerce throughout the seas of the East. It is the language of two great European communities which are rising, the one in the south of Africa, the other in Australasia. Communities which are every year becoming more important and more closely connected with our Indian Empire. Whether we look at the intrinsic value of our literature or at the particular situation of this country, we shall see the strongest reason to think that, of all foreign tongues, the English tongue is that which would be the most useful to our native subjects. So what's the real motivation here? What's he really thinking about?
Trade.
Yeah, what's going to make trade easier between different parts of the empire, right?
Because if they speak English, then they'll get along easier.
100%, yeah, they'll be able to communicate more easily, right? If everyone in different parts of the empire is being taught in their own native language, and if they don't speak English, it makes trade and communication between the various parts of the empire more difficult, right? And again, remember that the basic purpose of the colonial activity here is to generate profit, right? So that's what Macaulay's real argument is about. It's about making sure that the Indian colony makes money, right? Makes a return for its investors. And the best way to do that is then to connect it with other colonies with which it could, with which it has to trade through language. So the other sets of readings that I gave you for today are kind of set up in a kind of point-counterpoint kind of way. Right, so let's move here to the James Anthony Froude and the John Jacob Thomas pieces. So Froude is talking about the British in the West Indies. And I think that the Froude-Thomas argument here is pretty closely connected to a lot of the same arguments that Equiano and Mary Prince were making in the last set of texts that we looked at. So first off, let's look at the status of the British themselves in the West Indies. On page 696, as Froude begins his description here of Trinidad. Can I get somebody to read for me the first paragraph? It says Trinidad is not one of our oldest possessions.
Trinidad is not one of our oldest possessions, but we held it long enough for the old plan of civilization to take root and grow. And our road led us through jungles of flowering shrubs which were running wild over what had been once cultivated estates. Stranger still, for one associates colonial life instinctively with what is new and modern. We came at one place on an avenue of vast trees, at the end of which stood the ruins of a mansion of some great man of the departed order. Great man he must have been, for there was a gateway half crumbled away on which were his crest and shield and stone, with the borders on either side, like the baron of Rywarding's bears, fallen now like them, but unlike them never, I fear to be said of again. The Anglo-West Indians, like the English gentry in Ireland, were a fine race of men in their day, and perhaps the improving of them off of the earth has been a less beneficial process in either case than we are inhabited supposing.
Okay, thank you. So let's first off note the date of Froude's composition here. So he's writing in 1888. So this is 50-some years after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, right? And what's this thing that this place he's looking at, what did it used to be?
It looked like a great empire. It looked like a great empire too.
Uh-huh.
Like someone empowered lived there.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a crumbling mansion, right? What about the grounds around it? What's happened here?
There's a lot of trees.
Yeah, trees and flowering shrubs, right? Over what had once been cultivated estates. So we're in the West Indies, and we see a crumbling mansion, and a forest around what used to be cultivated estates. What was this place 50 years ago? Yeah, it was a plantation. Yeah.
I wasn't sure like what kind.
Okay. I guess the answer just seems so obvious that.
Yeah, I kind of was very unsure, so I just went for it.
Okay, yeah.
Rice, cotton, tobacco.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, if it's Trinidad, if we're in the West Indies, then probably sugar, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so what he's doing here is looking with admiration and nostalgia at a former plantation, right? And he's bothered by the state that this place is now in, and suggesting that maybe things were better back 50 years ago, right? It says the Anglo-West Indians, like the English gentry in Ireland, were a fine race of men in their day, and perhaps the improving them off the earth has been a less beneficial process in either case than we are in the habit of supposing. But he does at least relegate that to the past, right? It's like, okay, this is, a past that is not recoverable. But entering among the hills, we came upon their successors. In Trinidad, there are 18,000 freeholders, most of them Negroes and representatives of the old slaves. Their cabins are spread along the road on either side, overhung with breadfruit trees, tamarinds, calabash trees, out of which they make their cups and water jugs. The luscious grenadilla climbs among the branches, plantains throw their cool shade over the doors, oranges and limes and citrons perfume the air and droop their boughs under the weight of their golden burdens. There were yams in the gardens and cows in the paddocks, and cocoa bushes loaded with purple or yellow pods. Children played about in swarms, in happy idleness and abundance, with schools, too, at intervals, and an occasional Catholic chapel, for the old religion prevails in Trinidad, never having been disturbed. What form could human life assume more charming than that which we were now looking on? Once more, the earth does not contain any peasantry so well off, so well cared for, so happy, so sleek and contented as the sons and daughters of the emancipated slaves in the English West Indian Islands. Sugar may fail the planter, but cocoa, which each peasant can grow with small effort for himself, does not fail and will not. He may better his condition, if he has any such ambition, without stirring beyond his own ground, and so far perhaps his ambition may extend, if it is not turned off upon politics. Even the necessary evils of the tropics are not many or serious. His skin is proof against mosquitoes. There are snakes in Trinidad as there were snakes in Eden. Plenty snakes, said one of them who was at work in his garden. Plenty snakes, but no bitey. As to costume, he would prefer the costume of innocence if he was allowed. Clothes in such a climate are superfluous for warmth, and to the minds of the Negroes, unconscious that they are of shame, superfluous for decency. So, before looking at kind of the obvious racial implications of some of this, right? Let's look at the way he paints life on Trinidad here. What does this place look like? What does he think it would be like to live here? What are the things he notices about it, or the arguments he's making about it, kind of implicitly?
That would be like really nice to live there because like the cows and all the Catholic chapel, and then because there's religion, there's food, there's water, there's it's nice and pretty quick.
Yeah, he says idleness and you can live there in idleness and abundance, right? Not only is there plenty of food there, apparently you don't have to work very hard to get it, right? The island just gives. What about what people wear?
He says it's a warm place, so they're probably wearing not much clothing, like they probably wear like shorts and that's about it.
Yeah.
Maybe wear like a small dress and that's maybe about it.
Yeah, and he says as to costume, he would prefer the costume of innocence if he was allowed, right? So people would walk around naked here if they could, basically, is what he's saying.
Yeah, because it was saying something about decency and shame.
Yeah.
Shame.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so the island just gives forth everything you need. People don't really have to wear clothes. What does this kind of look like? How is he depicting this? Think about like, a popular like kind of image from religion or mythology that this kind of looks like. Yeah. This is, like this is like in Eden. This is a paradise, right? He
the
is
reason she put on clothes was because she felt shame.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, he describes this place as being like Eden, right? Untroubled by notions of things like shame, untroubled by things like politics, right? Because again, like what was the action? Does anybody remember what the nature of the fruit was that Eve supposedly ate in the garden?
It was, no, but it was, it looked very delicious though.
Uh-huh.
It was it looked good, but they were not supposed to have it.
Yeah, they were forbidden to eat.
It was a forbidden fruit.
Yeah.
And they were not supposed to have it, but it looked so good. The God was not taken. What, was it just an apple? I'm pretty sure it's just an apple. Or is that just because of Sleeping Beauty?
Well,
I've never seen Sleeping Beauty,
yeah.
so I don't know.
So it couldn't have been.
No way.
It couldn't have been an apple because the story comes from a part of the world where apples do not grow, and so an apple would be unknown to the Middle Eastern herdsmen who.
I think the Bible just calls it fruit.
Yes, this is fruit. Yeah, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So yeah, the problem here, the thing that they're not supposed to have is knowledge, right? They're supposed to remain there in a state of perfect innocence. Right? You don't need to know right from wrong if you're perfectly innocent, right? Yeah. If you're perfectly innocent, you don't need things like pants, right? So yeah, so what Froude is trying to paint us a picture of here is that kind of innocent state of early humanity, right? But it's also like, it's for a particular political purpose and also in a very patronizing and pretty racist kind of way, right? It's like these people are basically like children, right? And what would happen if you let them govern themselves, right? If they were taken out of the warm embrace of Mother Britannia, right? How would they manage? Now,
It sounds like they'd be pretty happy.
yeah, actually, it sounds like they might, if the land just gives forth as freely as he says, right? They
They'd be good.
probably do all right, yeah.
Pretty carefree, no rules.
Yeah.
Regulation.
But this isn't what he says, right? He goes on to talk about how, page 697, under the beneficent despotism of the English government, which knows no difference of color and permits no oppression, it's, okay, I'm just going to let that sit for a minute. They can sleep, lounge, and laugh away their lives as they please, fearing no danger, right? So they can enjoy all this because Britain is there to protect them, right?
Sounds political.
Yeah. And 100% is, right? Yeah. As life goes, he has been a lucky mortal. He was taken away from Dahomey and Ashanti, to be a slave indeed, but a slave to a less cruel master than he would have found at home. He had a bad time of it occasionally, and the plantation whip and the branding irons are not all dreams, yet his owner cared for him at least as much as he cared for his cows and his horses. Kind usage to animals is more economical than barbarity, and Englishmen in the West Indies were rarely inhuman. Now, we've already read other narratives that show this to be at best misinformed, right? But he's also, talking about these people, comparing them to cows and horses, right? And he's making the same kinds of arguments here that used to be made by those who wanted to maintain the slave trade, right? That what people were being brought into in British territories or in the Americas was better than what they were being taken away from. Now, what I want to do here is turn the page over to John Jacob Thomas, who creates as the title of his book the smushed together word Froudacity, right? Combining Froude's name with audacity. And so Thomas was a largely self-educated black intellectual from Trinidad. So let's look at the way he responds to Froude's arguments here. So, can somebody read the paragraph here that begins with this? Mr. Froude is speaking dogmatically here of his, or rather our West Indies on page 699.
As Bishop Froude speaking dogmatically here of his, or rather our West Indies, let us hear him as he proceeds. We have been a ruling power there for 250 years.
Very different.
Yeah. The whites whom we planted as our representatives are drifting into ruin, and they regard England and England's policy as the principal cause of it. The blacks, whom in a fit of virtuous benevolence we emancipated, do not feel particularly obliged to us. They think that if they think at all that they were ill treated originally and received no more than was due to them.
Okay, thank you. So that's him quoting Froude, right? You can keep going. Yeah.
Sorry,
That's all right. I should have specified.
Thus far, now as to the whites whom we planted as our representatives and who Mr. Froude affairs are drifting into ruin. We confess to a total ignorance of their whereabouts in these islands in this Jubilee year of rents of their whereabouts in these islands and this Jubilee emancipation of the representatives of Britain. Immediately before and after emancipation, we happen to know something which, on the testimony of Englishmen, Mr. Froude will be made quite welcome to before our task is ended. With respect to Mr. Froude's statement as to the ingratitude of the emancipated blacks, if it is aimed at the slaves who were actually set free, it is utterly untrue, for no class of persons in their humble or artless way are more attached to the Queen's Majesty, whom they regard as incarnated in her gracious person, the benevolence which Mr. Froude so
Jauntily
scoffs at. But if our censor's remark under this head is intended for the present generation of blacks, it is a pure and simple absurdity. What are we of the present day to be grateful to the us personified by Mr. Froude and the colonial office exportations.
Okay, thank you. So what Thomas is doing here, right, is dividing the English, or the representatives of the English here, up into a couple of different groups, right? On the one hand, you have that old planter aristocracy that Froude was clearly kind of nostalgic for, right? You also have the Queen herself, whom he is suggesting the people of Trinidad and the West Indies broadly admire, right? Yeah, we like the Queen. We've got no problem with the Queen. And then the current British colonial officials and these are the ones whom Thomas suggests, yeah, we feel genuinely not particularly obliged to and ungrateful towards, right? Because we really believe, from what we know of Englishmen, that very few indeed regard Mr. Froude's reproach otherwise than as a palpable adding of insult to injury, obliged to us indeed, right? So the current officials are the us that Froude was talking about, in which he includes himself, right? And which Thomas is going after now. Why, Mr. Froude, who speaks of us as dogs and horses, suggests the same kindliness of treatment that secures the attachment of those noble brutes would have the same result in our case. With the same consistency that marks his utterances throughout the book, he tells his readers that there is no original or congenital difference between the capacity of the white and the Negro races. He adds too significantly, with the same chances and with the same treatment, I believe that distinguished men would be produced equally from both races. After this truthful testimony, which Polion upon Asa of evidence is confirmed, does Mr. Froude, in the fatuity of his skin pride, believe that educated men, worthy of the name, would be otherwise than resentful, if not disgusted, at being shunted out of bread in their own native land, which their parents' labors and taxes have made desirable, in order to afford room to blockheads, vulgarians, or worse, imported from beyond the seas? Does Mr. Froude's scorn of the Negro skin extend, inconsistently on his part, to their intelligence and feelings also? And if so, what has the Negro to care, if let alone and not wantonly thwarted in his aspirations? It sounds queer, not to say unnatural and scandalous, that Englishmen should in these days of light be the champions of injustice towards their fellow subjects, not for any intellectual or moral disqualification, but on the simple account of the darker skin of those who are to be assailed and thwarted in their life's career and aspirations. Really, are we to be grateful that the color difference should be made the basis and justification of the dastardly denials of justice, social and intellectual and moral, which have characterized the regime of those who Mr. Froude boasts were left to be the representatives of Britain's morality and fair play? So what Thomas wants, right, he's got a political goal in mind here as well, right? He wants self-government for Trinidad and for other West Indian British possessions, right? And Froude's political argument is that self-government would be a disaster for these colonies, right? And what Thomas is trying to point out is inconsistency in Froude's arguments, right? You say that on the one hand, Froude, notes that all human beings have equal capacity for thought and intelligence, right? But at the same time, when it's convenient, denies that a particular group that happens to be of a different skin color than another tries to exercise their rights and their intelligence. They're told that no, they can't do that, right? Because you wouldn't do it right. Because you need Britain. And this is the kind of thing that the kind of paternalistic view of empire tends to run up against a lot, right? We see a similar thing. We're not going to have time to get to it, but we see a similar thing in Joseph Chamberlain's argument, right? Where he's talking about empire as being something that's done for the good of the people conquered and colonized, right? What that means is that you're assuming that the people that you're conquering and colonizing are unable to govern themselves, or that the government that they would choose for themselves is somehow wrong or dangerous, right? So it's going back to your kind of citing of Gobineau at the beginning of the class, right? It's that assumption that, say, English people or French people or Germans know better than the people who actually live in a place and have lived there from time immemorial. And so Britain's relationship with its colonies is really complicated in this way, right? Early on, and we do see some historical development here, right? Early on, there is very little illusion that colonization and imperialism are primarily about military and economic superiority. But then later in the 19th century, as more and more people in Britain feel uncomfortable with the imperial project as a whole, that maybe this isn't actually such a great or nice thing that we're doing, even if it does, like, give us tea and sugar and things like that, it becomes entwined with religious and humanitarian motives. Right, that the goal becomes, at least in certain circles, to spread Christianity and to spread the benefits of British culture specifically throughout the world, right? So, like, as an example of this, how many of you have ever heard of the Rhodes Scholarship? Any of you know what this is? You ever heard of anyone described as a Rhodes Scholar or? Okay, so the Rhodes Scholarship is it's a prestigious award that brings students from outside the UK to study at Oxford University, and pays most of their way, pays the room and board, things like that, right? It's named for a guy by the name of Cecil John Rhodes, who was the initial founder of the scholarship. There is actually a cartoon picture of Rhodes in your book on page 710. It was his ambition to connect British possessions in Egypt to British possessions in South Africa via telegraph wires. So that's why in this picture he's standing across, like astride Africa, with his arms out, with telegraph wires strung across them. But Rhodes founded this scholarship because he believed firmly in the superiority of British culture, and that bringing students from elsewhere to study in England would make them more British, would then make the places they went back to more British, and thus generally spread Britishness everywhere, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a similar kind of nationalism, right? You know, that this assumption that no place but your place can be any good, right? And this is what, there's actually been a lot of lobbying on the part of students and some faculty at Oxford to change the name of the scholarship or its funding model or whatever, right, to try to take it away from this association with Rhodes and people like him.
I really don't think people are that as bad as they sound. Like, I don't think that they mean to be as bad as they.
Yeah, well, I mean, with Rhodes, there's a lot more to him than the notions of British superiority. There's also like a lot of really, really exploitative economic practices in South Africa, and nasty things he did in diamond mines and things like that. So there's a lot attached to this guy. Yeah.
Well, McCarthy, I don't think he was all bad. I just think that was messed up.
McCarthy was prior to his role in the Subcommittee on Un-American Activities, he was just a Republican backbencher who nobody paid any attention to, and suddenly he had a megaphone and people were paying attention to him. I think that's a lot of what drove him. All right, so we're going to move from the 19th into the 20th century next time. So most of what you're going to be reading for next time is going to be concerned with immigrants and colonials and their relationship to the English language specifically. So yeah, Louise Bennett's Jamaican, Kamal Braithwaite is, I'm trying to remember exactly where he's from. I think he's from the Virgin Islands. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is from Kenya, and Salman Rushdie is Indian.